The ever-present threat of death makes people do weird things, like making graphically explicit keepsakes or whipping themselves to appease God. And those aren't the only disturbing aspects of the Black Death. According to the World Health Organization, the plague commonly known as the Black Death killed around 50 million people in the 14th century. This outbreak was specifically a case of the bubonic plague, which inflames the lymph nodes as it multiplies and turns into open sores. It also caused fever, chills, fatigue, and vomiting. The one consolation was that victims only lived for about 3 to 5 days after developing their first symptoms. Less consoling was surely the 3 to 5 day incubation period during which a person is infected but asymptomatic, which gave them plenty of time to spread the infection around. And just as death waited for victims, so did indignity. A contemporary chronicler from Florence wrote about dead people laid in a pit in the church graveyard covered with a layer of earth and then another layer of corpses, while comparing it to the layers of pasta and cheese and lasagna.
Bury me in cheese!
The Black Death swept across Europe between 1346 and 1353, but that wasn't the first time that this happened. An earlier outbreak began in 541 AD during the reign of Justinian, and it lasted for at least 225 years. To be specific, it came to Constantinople in 542. Before then, it had been lurking in the shadows of the Byzantine Empire for a while, moving along the trade routes through northeast India, China, and even over to Egypt. But once it hit one of the most important cities in the world, things got serious. The devastation and sickness lasted for centuries because of a weird confluence of factors that started with the first of 2 volcanic eruptions. The air was filled with debris, and it was made even worse when a piece of Halley's Comet collided with Earth and kicked up more dust. The climate cooled, crops failed, and people were vulnerable, resulting in the perfect breeding ground for plague. Justinian's plague disappeared around 750 AD, and there wasn't another large-scale pandemic recorded until the Black Death. It's not entirely clear where the 14th century outbreak came from, but there are a couple of theories. Europe had only recently opened to Eastern trade in 1346, and while there hadn't been any major outbreaks for centuries, there were pockets of the plague. One was in Asia's Lake Izikul, that's in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, where archaeologists have pinpointed a plague dating to 1338 and 1339. It's also been found in China throughout the 1320s. It was in Europe by 1347, with pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers carrying it to Mecca and Britain in 1349. It is generally known that the plague entered Europe through the ports of Messina and Genoa. In October 1347, trade ships made port in Sicily filled with silks from the Far East and also with dying sailors. But silks were just one way the plague spread, and the Tartars had a much more creative way. The city of Kaffa was under siege with the Tartars already suffering from the plague. That threw off their plans for conquest, so the siege ended. As a parting gift, they catapulted their dead into the city. Seriously. So when people left Kaffa by ship for continental Europe, they took the plague with them. Nothing like a little accidental biological warfare to help wipe out your enemies. The plague had another devastating consequence. It pretty much ruined the reputation of rats. But according to research by the University of Oslo, those rodents weren't actually responsible for keeping plague dormant before reintroducing it to humans. Researchers have looked at pockets and outbreaks of plague during the Black Death, and they found that they corresponded with climate fluctuations. Large-scale climate change seemed to exacerbate the plague in the 6th century, and the same factors could have been at work hundreds of years later. When the weather gets warmer and wetter, rat populations decline. This means that plague-carrying fleas need to find other homes, so they're forced to migrate to domestic animals and ultimately to humans. Good luck not getting itchy while thinking about that. You know it's a strange world when a major newspaper publishes the headline, "Don't worry, a ghost ship crewed by cannibal rats probably isn't about to hit the British Isles." But it turns out that that sort of idea isn't that far-fetched, because that's exactly how the plague made its way to Norway. It spread fairly slowly, and the northernmost regions of Europe even thought they might escape the Black Death, until sometime in late 1349 or early 1350. When a ship left England in 1349, it was heading north carrying a hefty cargo of wool and plague. Every single person on the ship succumbed. The ship kept its course. It ran aground close to Norway's Bergen Harbor, dumping fleas and rats into the previously untouched country. It's unclear how many died. Estimates suggested it was about a third of the country. From Norway, it spread into Sweden and finally Russia. People who were alive during the Black Death were experiencing what must have seemed like the end times, and for many, it absolutely was.
End of days! End of days!
But at least in some ways, it wasn't too different from our modern era, as one city's leaders developed a now familiar way of dealing with the plague: quarantine. The idea of separating the infected from the rest of the population dates at least as far back as the time of the Old Testament, when lepers were condemned to a life of exile. But a formal sort of quarantine, and the word itself, goes back to the medieval port city of Ragusa, which is now Dubrovnik, Croatia. In 1377, the city's council passed a series of laws that included a month-long isolation period for newcomers. Anyone who wasn't officially tasked with caring for those in isolation was forbidden from visiting them, or else they would have to serve a 30-day stint there as well. The idea spread to other cities, and eventually the 30-day period became 40 days, though it's unclear why. It may have had something to do with the biblical significance of 40 days, or the Greek idea that contagious diseases needed 40 days to show symptoms. It wasn't that long ago that having a uterus and drinking absinthe were thought to be causes of madness. So when scores of people started dying from the plague, the doctors of the time were hopelessly in over their heads.
We're doomed.
The medical community was still governed by the ancient Greek idea that illness was caused by an imbalance in the body's humors, so other cures were focused on trying to get everything back in harmony. Doctors tried bloodletting, lancing boils, burning herbs, and bathing in rose water or vinegar. There was even a belief that the plague was caused by stiff air, so people tried ringing bells and letting birds fly around the sick. Doctors also tried giving their patients drinks of vinegar, 10-year-old treacle, which is basically like molasses, and of course mercury. If the poisonous mercury didn't work, you could always just rub pigeon, snake parts, onions, or herbs on the boils. Compared to the mercury, doesn't sound that bad, right? In the 14th century, many doctors realized that they were fighting a fight they couldn't win, so they fled their towns. Cities and municipalities then hired other plague doctors to care for the dying. While some were complete frauds and others answered the call in hopes of swindling devastated families out of everything they owned, they've come to be one of the most iconic symbols of the Black Death. The creepy plague doctor costume with the bird-like mask wasn't designed until the 17th century. It was a creation of Charles Delorme, the favorite physician of the Medici family and the French royal court. Delorme hoped to isolate himself from the plague that his patients were carrying, so the entire head-to-toe outfit had a waxy coating. The gloves, boots, and leather hood were tied shut with leather strips, and the eyes were protected by glass domes. As for that iconic mask, the beak was filled with herbs in the hope that they would filter the air. The French went a step further, as their beaks would be set on fire to produce smoke that they believed was even more cleansing. As you probably guessed, most of the time it didn't work. The plague doctors who didn't die often became outcasts, not to mention the stuff of nightmares.
It's nightmare fuel. That'll be with me forever.
Contrary to popular belief, the London Underground doesn't weave around in order to avoid plague pits. There are in fact no records of construction crews uncovering human remains while digging the underground, and most of the tunnels are 40 to 80 feet down, much deeper than any plague pit would be. So what's the truth about those plague pits supposedly spread all over the country? According to University of London historian Vanessa Harding, even when the plague got really bad, most of the victims were still buried in cemeteries and other designated burial grounds. People understandably needed some stability during these dark times, so giving their loved ones a proper burial was a way to provide a degree of comfort. Most stories about plague pits are merely legend and lore, and we even know who's at least partially to blame for popularizing the idea. That would be Robinson Crusoe author Daniel Defoe, who listed some fictional plague pits for his drama A Journal of the Plague Year. That being said, there were actual pits dug to dump plague victims in. They actually became a bit more common about 300 years later during a different plague. Real plague pits, as in the Black Death ones, are rare finds, but even those bodies weren't just dumped off the death cart. They were buried carefully, or at least as carefully as they could by people who were also dying. 50 million people may have died during the Black Death, but millions more managed to survive. When researchers from the University of South Carolina looked at the skeletons of the survivors, they found that post-Black Death people were generally healthier and lived longer. The number of people living to at least 70 nearly tripled in the years after the pandemic. There were also more people than before living past 50, and this trend seemed to continue for the next 200 years. Researchers aren't entirely sure why this is the case, but they have some ideas. It might be as simple as improvements in diet and standards of living, though it might also be because the Black Death took away the weakest sections of the population. When anthropologists from the University at Albany looked at skeletons of those who had succumbed to the plague, they found that the disease was much more likely to kill the weak, the elderly, and those who were already sick. By default, the overall population rebounded to be even stronger and healthier after they were gone.
I'll be a living god!
You might think that the plague was wiped out centuries ago, but it's actually still around, and it's still mostly the same. Researchers analyzed the powdery residue inside the teeth of plague victims of London's East Smithfield Cemetery and were able to map the entire genome of the bacteria that caused the Black Death. When they compared that to the genome of modern plague, they found only slight differences, but something did change during the plague years. Researchers in the Netherlands found that there's a difference in the genes of European and Roma peoples compared to those from India. About 20 genes seem to have evolved simultaneously in Europeans and in the Roma, but not in India, where there was no major 14th century plague outbreak. Several of the genes govern immune function, and one cluster specifically causes a major response to plague bacteria. That suggests that the Black Death sped up human adaptation to help some of us survive. It was the summer of 1665 when the Black Death arrived in the English village of Eyam, having traveled up from London on pieces of cloth carrying infected fleas. The local tailor, his assistant, and their families were among the first to die. While there was arguably still time for the healthy to flee, that's not what they decided to do at all. If they carried the plague to neighboring villages, they would only spread death. So instead, they did something incredible. They stayed, buried their dead, and waited to die. By the time the plague had run its course in Eyam, parish records say that 267 of the village's 344 residents were dead, including the stonemason, which left survivors to etch the names of their loved ones on gravestones themselves. Some buried entire families, like Elizabeth Hancock, who lost and buried her husband and 6 children over the course of 8 days. Meanwhile, others erected stones around the village that marked locations for trade. William Maupassant was the one who spearheaded the quarantine movement. He wrote about knowing that his wife was soon to join the dead when she reported that the air smelled sweet to her. That sweet smell was a sign that the infection had already begun to spread rot through her internal organs. Eyam's sacrifice helped kickstart practices of disinfecting, quarantine, and disease prevention.
Their legacy is inspiring.
The practice of keeping trinkets from the dead, such as locks of hair, is called Memento Mori. It rose in popularity during the Victorian era, but the idea was around much longer than that. That, along with the Danse Macabre motif, both trace their origins to the Black Death. Memento Mori involves realistic death imagery, like tombs carved with the stone effigies of rotting corpses. The Danse Macabre, meanwhile, was a depiction of death, often as skeletons, sometimes as rotting corpses, walking alongside or dancing with the living.
Where is he? The angel of death. I've been waiting so long.
While death had previously been viewed as a peaceful end to a mortal life and a transition that would see the soul ushered into a heavenly afterlife, that changed in a big way during the plague. People buried their own loved ones, walked past piles of corpses, and looked for perhaps inevitable signs of infection in themselves. As death literally moved among the people, art began to reflect that. While it's morbid at a glance, it's also a pragmatic reminder that things like social standing and wealth ultimately don't mean a thing in the end. When the Black Death spread across the continent throughout the 14th century, people wanted answers. Rumors started circulating that it was a punishment from God, delivered upon a population that had allowed Muslims and Jews to continue to live among them. Jewish communities actually had a lower death rate from the plague, but that was because of their strict religious guidelines regarding hand-washing, bathing, burials, and sanitation. And if that wasn't bad enough, some Jewish communities were accused of actively trying to spread the plague to Christians, and the idea that conspirators were poisoning wells and other sources of drinking water also spread. The wholesale slaughter of entire Jewish communities became all too frequent. In what is now modern-day Germany, more than 6,000 people died during one conflict in Mainz, and another 2,000 people were burned alive in Strasbourg. Between 1349 and 1350, nearly all Jews were either killed or forced out of England, Germany, and France. Hundreds of communities were destroyed, and by 1400, the 19,000-strong Jewish population of Frankfurt had been reduced to around 10 families. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and it's difficult to imagine the horror that unfolded as the Black Death became one of the worst disease outbreaks in history. At the time, many believed that people were being killed by a god who was surely angry about something. So a movement took hold to try to appeal to God for mercy, in which people shed their own blood.
That's gotta hurt!
The flagellants believed that their sacrifice was akin to Jesus's, and that it would surely demonstrate how sorry they were for their failings. After all, they had brought this terrible illness upon themselves in the first place. Flagellants had already been around for some time by the height of the Black Death. The movement was first inspired around 1260 by an Italian hermit who had reportedly gotten directions from the Virgin Mary herself. But it wasn't until the 14th century that communities of flagellants traveled across Europe to hold public displays of ritualistic self-flogging and singing. Dressed in white robes, flagellants would strip to the waist, kneel, and beat themselves while others sang songs. Lyrics included this one from the Song of the Flatulence during the time of plague. Now here comes the wave of evil, flee from hot hell. Lucifer is an evil companion. Whomever he catches, he smears with pitch. Therefore, we intend to flee him. You have to admit, it is catchy. In 1709, Europe was devastated by a deadly frost that remains largely mysterious today. It was one particularly devastating incident in a larger centuries-long period of cold weather that's been dubbed the Little Ice Age. That name is typically applied to the period between 1500 and 1850, although some researchers add a century or two on the beginning of that. The era was marked by lower than normal temperatures, freezing rivers, and mass starvation. There's been all kinds of theories about what caused the Little Ice Age, but it was perhaps a perfect storm of conditions that included volcanic eruptions and the Black Death. That's the theory put forward by a research team from the Netherlands. They used lakebed sediment to examine the historical records preserved there. Their data suggests that around 1347 there was a massive dip in cereal grains. 1347 was, of course, the year that marks the beginning of the Black Death in Europe. The researchers believe that as the Black Death spread, crops went unharvested and unplanted, farms went untended, and agricultural lands ultimately returned to nature. Reforestation happened on such a large scale that more carbon dioxide was absorbed from the atmosphere, helping lower the temperature and kicking off what would become a centuries-long cold spell. When the Black Death re-emerged in the mid-17th century, the status quo was shattered irrevocably. In London, for example, those who could flee did so, while those who were left behind had to fend for themselves, even when it came to medical treatment and the recording and reporting of deaths. And that record-keeping was more important than ever. The era's bills of mortality remain some of the most detailed records of plague deaths in London, and they were made possible by a group of women called the Searchers. The position of Searcher was a formal one. Each London parish would essentially employ a pair of women to collect the bodies of the dead and do an examination and determination of the cause of death. It's unclear exactly when the first Searchers were hired, but it seems to have been an official profession since at least the 1530s. Official laws governing the Searchers stressed that while they were employed, they were forbidden from other work, as it was likely that they would contract the plague themselves. Bribery was common, especially considering that a ruling of plague would result in quarantining entire homes and families. All the information gathered by the Searchers would pass through a few different people and ultimately be published in the weekly record known as the Bills of Mortality. In 1665, at least 70% of the city's recorded deaths were attributed to the plague. It's safe to say that the world is still fascinated by the era of the Vikings, and interestingly enough, it turns out that the Black Death may have played a big part in their downfall. Greenland was a Viking stronghold for several centuries, starting around 985 AD. Viking presence there grew to several settlements around 12 churches, and no one's ever been able to say for sure what exactly happened to them. They started to decline by the end of the 14th century, and by the middle of the 15th, it seems as though everyone was just gone. A popular theory hinges on two things. The Black Death is involved in both of them. The Little Ice Age changed the area's climate so much that the Vikings were unable to raise livestock and farm, and the waters around Greenland also became dangerous. That shut them off from fishing stocks and made it harder to receive and ship goods, including walrus ivory, one of the most lucrative exports. However, there wasn't much demand for it anymore since elephant ivory was now all the rage. Remember that bit we mentioned before about the Norwegian city of Bergen and the rats and the ship and the Dethi? That was the main port of call to head to Greenland, so it effectively severed any ties that may have been able to save Greenland's Viking settlements. Anyone who's a big enough history buff has probably seen images of admittedly strange and unfriendly to the algorithm metal badges depicting human genitalia. Sometimes those genitalia have wings, sometimes they're on boats or on horseback, and sometimes they're being carried on the shoulders of people who seem to be participating in some kind of parade. These badges coincided with one of the most brutal outbreaks of the Black Death, and many were made starting around 1350. At the time, saints who were believed to bestow protection against the plague and illness were very popular, so they were honored with parades and processions as well as pilgrimages and special masses. Badges were likely handed out at such events. As medieval folklorist Malcolm Jones explained in his book The Secret Middle Ages, by the exposure of the genital icon, whether male or female, they were intended to disarm that ever-present yet vague malevolence known as the evil eye. Research done for the University of Louisville supports this theory. The phenomenon has been largely uninvestigated and written off as bizarrely vulgar when it was in fact the precise opposite. Well into the 17th century, there was a persistent theory that the plague was spread via eye contact, so it makes sense that these badges might have acted as a protective talisman by giving potentially infected people something interesting to look at. Do I need to say it? I guess we do. It turns out that yes, you do need those stinking badges.